Harold would never forget the strange house in the middle of the cul-de-sac. There were all sorts of rumors about that house, but most were just the stories children made up to explain strange things. The local kids said that the woman who lived there was a witch. They said that she kidnapped and ate children. They said that if you went by that house at night, you could see strange lights coming from the basement, and sometimes you could hear screams after dark. They claimed that she had lived there for years and years, and that the old woman had existed there for generations. When Harold asked his mother about these things, she said that Mrs. Renfro was just a lonely old lady who lived all alone. However, his friend Davy Parker insisted that she was a witch. If she's just a normal old lady, how come animals won't go into her house? On that, he was right. Not all animals, Harold supposed. Mostly just cats. Cats would not come anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. There were many strays on the road, cats squatting in people's yards to hunt mice or snakes, but none of them would go anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. The cats wouldn't even use the sidewalk in front of her fence. You could watch them sometimes, as they stopped at the fence line and crossed the street instead, risking being hit by traffic instead of walking near her home. It was as if there was a magnetic pulse around the place that repelled members of the feline race. She owned cats, of course. The boys had seen her take many of them into the house, all of them hissing and yowling as they battered against their carrier. Once they went in, though, they never saw any of them again. There was talk around town that the local animal shelter wouldn't give her cats anymore. They said that she'd been housing about 4 to 5 a year for as long as anyone could remember. But when a well check found that none of the cats were on the premises, they had stopped letting her foster them. That didn't stop her from getting them, though. She had traps that she set up around town and worked out a deal with the local dog catcher to bring her cats when he found them. Mr. Barley was not what you would call a nice guy. He was mean enough to dogs, and most people would believe that he would trap cats for her. His son Thomas was a big brute, known for throwing bags of animals into the local river for entertainment. He'd been picked up by the police a time or two for hurting people's pets, and that kind of behavior was usually learned from somewhere. Harold and his friends, Ralph, Stephen, and Davy, had been watching the house for as long as they could remember. Mrs. Renfro never decorated for holidays. She never handed out candy for Halloween. She never returned any of the balls or toys that might land in her yard, and chased away anyone who tried to retrieve them. No one ever went there to sell magazines or chocolate bars for school fundraisers, and if they tried, they were always chased away. Mrs. Renfro was a sour old woman, somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s, but there was talk that she might have been older than that. Harold's mother told him about how Mrs. Renfro had acted the same way when she was a kid. It couldn't have been the same Mrs. Renfro, though it does look just like her. She constantly ran kids off her property, or yelled at those who rode their bikes too close to the fence. She was a sour old crone, but this must be her daughter or a cousin or something. The Mrs. Renfro that I knew would be older than dirt by now. She told the boys this story as they sat eating watermelon on the back porch one summer, and it sparked a real fire in them. They wanted to know more about Mrs. Renfro, and in their minds, it could absolutely be the same one. Her reputation for being a wicked old witch had been cemented in the minds of most of the town's children. The idea that she had existed there for multiple generations wasn't as far-fetched as Harold's mom had thought it was. So, as they started their school break, the boys began spying on their reclusive neighbor. Like the nerd he was, Ralph wanted to start with the boring bits. "We should go to the library. We can see if they have the same Mrs. Renfro that lived there when Harold's mom was a kid." "And how are we going to do that?" Davy asked. "You know they're not going to let a bunch of kids go and look at records like that. Those kinds of things are only for lawyers and policemen. The two had argued about it, but in the end, they had decided that some good old-fashioned surveillance might be their best option. So, they had staked out the old lady's house for the next week. The boys left on their bikes around daybreak and got a good spot on Davy's front porch. Davy's house was right across from hers on the cul-de-sac and had the best view of her front yard. They stayed and watched the house until the streetlights came on, all of them racing for home before they got into trouble. The streetlights meant it was dinner time, and missing dinner would make their mothers into bigger monsters than that mean old witch, Mrs. Renfro. After 5 days, the boys hadn't seen much, besides Mrs. Renfro coming home with a new cat in a carrier. Davy was getting frustrated as the sun set on Friday afternoon. "This is stupid," he said as he threw his binoculars against the grass. "We've given up 2 perfectly good baseball games, a bike race with Mark Hollister, and a chance to go to the movies on Thursday, just to watch this old lady's house." "Well, how else do you think we're going to find anything out?" Harold asked. Davy thought about it for a minute, and then he got an idea. He went inside, and the other 3 boys heard him talking to his mother. He was using his pleading voice, the voice he put on when he was trying to convince her to give him some money or let him do something. They all knew he would manage whatever he was after. Davy's mom was a soft touch, and always had been. After a little back and forth, they heard him exclaim how much he loved her and come back outside. He had his chest puffed out as he came to join them, and a smile that made him look like the cat that had caught the canary. "Ask your parents when you get home tonight if you can stay on Saturday. I think most of the good stuff happens after dark, so we can watch from the front windows and catch it." They all agreed, saying that sounded like a great idea. Davy's dad, a trucker who was on the road more than not, was still off on a delivery. Davy's mom was the doting sort, who loved to give her son whatever he wanted. That meant that even if they didn't catch Mrs. Renfro in anything, they could still play Super Nintendo or watch scary movies in his room. Even if they didn't solve the mystery of the neighborhood witch, it would still be a fun night. To no one's surprise, their parents agreed to let them stay the night, and as the sun began to set Saturday night, all 4 were in the living room with their binoculars out. Davy's mother had told them to not make too much racket and gone up to read in her bed. They were trying to be sneaky, but anyone could have seen the binoculars hiding underneath Mrs. Parker's gauzy curtains in the living room. It had been a slow day on watch, and the boys hadn't seen Mrs. Renfro leave her house all day. They supposed she might have snuck out while they were eating lunch or munching on the pizza that Davy's mom had bought them, but they doubted it. Her old van was still in the same position, and the package the postman had left that morning was still sitting on the doorstep. It had been an all-day event, and the boys almost vibrated with excitement as they watched the sun set behind her creepy old house. As darkness began to fall, Stephen said he thought he saw something from one of the basement windows. They all looked in that direction, and sure enough, there was something going on down there. A weird funhouse glow was coming from the windows, a soupy green color, like you saw in scary movies. Davy said he thought he saw smoke, too, and the longer they looked, the more the boys imagined that they could see smoke curling up from underneath the windowsill. Not the kind of smoke you got from a fire, of course. This was soft and translucent, like the smoke you saw when your mom made soup. "I knew it! I knew if we stayed past dark we'd see something." Harold thought the glow was cool, but it wasn't really proof of anything. For all they knew, that's where she kept her TV, and she was just watching something weird. Maybe she was down there smoking the stuff that he caught his sister puffing on behind the house, and they were watching no more than her relaxing after a long day of being terrible. Either way, the glow wasn't much proof of anything. "We need to get closer," someone said. It wasn't until Harold found the other 3 looking at him that he realized he had been the one to say it. "That's a great idea," Davy said, putting down his binoculars. He looked pretty excited about the prospect of sneaking up on the old woman's house, but Harold suddenly wished he hadn't said anything. Mrs. Renfro's house was creepy enough in the daytime, and the idea of going over her fence at night was a little too spooky for him. It was just a thought, guys. If she caught us sneaking over there after dark, she'd have we can go out the back and creep around the side of the house, Davy said, clearly not listening. My mom will never hear the door and think we've just gone up to my room if she comes downstairs. Stephen and Ralph were all for it, though Harold thought Ralph looked a little queasy. Just to be safe, they all went running up the stairs like a herd of gazelles to get their flashlights from their backpack. They had all brought them with the idea of telling scary stories later that night, but they might be put to better use now. Once they had them, they snuck back downstairs as quietly as they could and managed to make their way out the back door. There was still a little stab of daylight left as they came through Davy's backyard and around the front of the house. As they crossed the street in a mad hustle, it dipped below the horizon and left them in darkness, at least until the street lights came on in a small flurry of snapping bulbs. They stood beneath one of the lamplights, crouching low as they observed the front of Mrs. Renfro's house. The front lawn was covered in tall grass and weeds, children's toys dotting it like pirate treasure. From behind all the tall grass, they could see the green glow as it came from the small windows. The boys hopped the low fence as they snuck through the hip-high grass and up to the windows. As they lay on their bellies and looked down through those slats, Harold could see that Mrs. Renfro was not, in fact, watching TV and relaxing after a long day. What they saw seemed to be better proof that she was a witch. The basement looked identical to the one in Harold's house. A single steep staircase ran down into a concrete room with shelves and hooks on the wall. The floor, a flat sheet of concrete. Instead of a washer, a dryer, and a mound of holiday decorations, however, a large metal pot sat in the middle of the floor. The pot, more like a bathtub than a soup pot, was the source of the green glow, and the liquid inside swirled with eldritch light. Mrs. Renfro was stirring it with a long spoon or maybe a broom handle, and though her mouth was moving, none of them could tell what she was saying. On a shelf near the pot was the cat they had seen her bring in a few days before. "Holy crap," whispered Ralph, pushing away from the window. "She really is a witch." Harold nodded, all of them moving back from the window so she couldn't see them. But Davy stayed put. He was focused on that cat, the one on the shelf that she was clearly planning to do something with. Harold didn't really like how intent he was. Davy was prone to doing things that weren't strictly smart sometimes, things that might be considered noble if they weren't so suicidal. Last summer, Davy had saved a kid from drowning at Gopher Pond, an act that had almost sent him under as well. The year before, he had shoved a kid out of the way of a truck, earning himself a broken arm and a commendation from the mayor. Davy didn't lack for courage. Sometimes he lacked for sense, though. When he picked up the rock, Harold was afraid that he might throw it through the little window and give them away. Instead, he rolled like a log and tossed it at Miss Renfro's front door. The old woman stiffened, climbing down off her stool as she hobbled towards the stairs on her gouty legs. "What are you doing?" Harold whispered, looking at Davy incredulously. "Getting that cat," Davy said. As she got to the top of the stairs, he pushed the window and grinned as it popped inward. He slid inside as Ralph began to hyperventilate, and Stephen asked what the heck he thought he was doing. Harold whispered he didn't know, but quieted as the front door came open and a quavery voice cascaded across the lawn. "Who is it?" she croaked, sounding more like a bullfrog than a woman. "What nasty beasties are taking me from my work?" The three boys got as low as they could in that tall grass, hoping it would cover them as the specter descended the steps. "Are you hiding?" she rasped. the stairs squeaking under her feet as her bunched old legs brought her closer to the yard. Harold put a hand over Ralph's mouth as his wheezing became louder. He undoubtedly needed his inhaler, but the sound of its trigger would alert the old biddy. Stephen had begun to shimmy a little, trying to get around the edge of the house, but as her patent leather shoe came down with a clump on the cobblestone path in front of her, he froze like a statue. If she had a flashlight, they'd be seen, but Harold didn't think she had one. She hadn't turned on the porch light either, and with any luck, her old eyes wouldn't see them if they stayed absolutely still. She took a step into the grass, and Harold almost pulled his hand away as he felt Ralph's tears touch his skin. She took another, and Harold thought she might be casting a spell before he realized it was just Stephen, quietly praying. She took a third step, and Harold shut his eyes tight as he hoped beyond hope that she wouldn't see them. The seconds slipped on for an indeterminate time, but finally she turned and hobbled back up the stairs. When the door closed, they all breathed a sigh of relief before pulling back to the window to see if Davy had been caught. Not only had Davy not been caught, but as they caught sight of him, he was lifting the cat carrier off the shelf. He had taken the stepladder that the witch had been standing on and was reaching on tiptoes to grasp the side of the cat carrier. None of them could hear if the cat was cooperating, but it didn't look as if Davy was going to manage to get the cage off the shelf without dropping it. Harold had just shimmied to go help him when the croak of the witch brought him up short and sealed Davy's fate. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" she screeched, and Davy must have jumped because he was suddenly falling towards the tub of glowing liquid. The cat carrier fell to the concrete with a smack, and a small white animal shot out like a cannonball as it tore off towards the upstairs. It ran right between the startled legs of the crone, but she was more interested in the boy that was now bobbing in her cauldron. They both began to scream simultaneously. Mrs. Renfro doubled over, falling down the stairs as she clutched at her stomach. She was still when she came to rest on the concrete, but Harold could see her twitching as whatever was happening took effect. The tub could not have been deeper than a foot or two, but Davy was suddenly splashing like a drowning man. He was shrinking, his skin growing taut and spotted, his hair growing gray and brittle. His teeth fell out, floating in the soup before dissolving into nothing. His eyes joined them, his skeletal hands still grasping at hope. As they watched, their friend shuddered out a last few moments of his life, his body dissolving as he sank into the tub. They ran screaming from the yard, thundering into Davy's house as they went to find the closest adult they could. The police were there before they could finish telling it all, and the 4 squad cars lit up the cul-de-sac like a Christmas light show. Harold's father was amongst them, being one of the deputies for their little town, which was how Harold found out more than he strictly wanted to the next day. Harold had gone home with his mother, Mrs. Parker speaking with the police as she begged them to find her son. He had gone to sleep on the couch under the scratchy afghan his mother had crocheted, and dreamed about the pool of liquid in Mrs. Renfro's basement. In the dream, Davy's skeleton had burst out of it as he stood beside the cauldron, grabbing him and trying to drag him in. It screamed and screamed, his ears ringing with it, and when he tossed and turned his way off the couch, he awoke to find his mother and father talking in the kitchen. Old Biddy was kinda nuts. She had all these books and diagrams, satanic stuff. She had this big tub of liquid down there. The coroner thinks it's acid or something, but they aren't really sure. He paused, and Harold almost heard the shudder in his father's voice. They found bone fragments at the bottom of the tub. They aren't sure, but they think they might be human." "Did they find any sign of Davy?" his mother asked. "Not really. They can't be sure that the bone fragments are his, but if the boy's story's right, I guess they'd have to be. I hope that terrible woman rots in prison," his mother half whispered, expressing more venom in her words than Harold had ever heard from her before. "Not unless we find her," he said unhappily. "She was gone when we arrived." "How far could she have gotten? She'd have to be pushing 100. "I don't know, but the journals I found will stick with me for a long time. She was..." He shuddered a little, and Harold peeked around the corner of the couch to snoop on his parents. "She was killing cats. She talked about how she would drown them in that tub and steal their lives." "Steal their lives?" "Cats are supposed to have 9 lives. She was stealing their lives to stay alive. She was so delusional. She thought the cats were keeping her from dying. The journal entries went way, way back, long before you and I were born. She was a sick woman who believed she'd lived for centuries." Mrs. Renfro's house sat empty for a long time. The families that moved in never stayed for long. They always said the same thing. They told the realtor that the house was lovely, but they felt watched while they were there. The toys disappeared from the yard, reclaimed by their owners, but Harold and his friends never returned to that house again. Davy's family moved away a few months after his disappearance. His mother couldn't deal with the loss of her son, and his house was soon occupied by a new family. Time went on. Harold and his friends returned to school. People forgot about Davy and Mrs. Renfro. A news story began to circulate, though, as the stories always do. Kids claimed to see a young woman walking the streets at night. She would lure children away, singing to them and telling them how she wanted to play. She was said to be luring more than a few teens away as well, though Harold doubted she had offered to play with them. There were reports of people missing, but never enough to spark much panic. They could be chalked up to runaways or kids lost in the woods, and the town continued. Harold knew that they were more than stories, though. He saw the woman outside his window most nights, he and Stephen and Ralph. She called to them, telling them to come and play. She told them that Davy missed them, and they could see him again if they wanted. When they refused her or ignored her, she would go into the woods behind their houses, disappearing into the shadows. Sometimes they could see a strange green glow from the woods late at night. Harold wondered how many years Mrs. Renfro had gotten from Davy, and how many more she would get before the town finally put an end to her. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you think you might be able to handle just one more creepy tale, go ahead and click on one of the stories you can doubtlessly see appearing at the end of this one. If you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. Maybe hit that bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If, like so many of my patrons, you decide you'd like to get your spooky a little bit earlier, why not come on down to Patreon and have a look at some of the great tiers that I have. My $5 tiers get their spooky a little early, and they have their name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. If you'd like a copy of my latest book, there's a link below to my Amazon profile. I've got mini books. I'm sure you'll find one that'll suit you there. I always recommend Stragview Stories, as it's the one I'm the most proud of. It contains a large collection of prison horror stories out of Stragview, the prison that I've made in the Georgia Hills. So, if you'd like to have a look, come on down. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being my Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.